The studio lights burned brighter than usual that night, their glare slicing through the tension that hung in the air like a storm about to break. Across the polished debate table sat Jessica Tarlov, calm yet coiled, the kind of quiet ready that speaks louder than fury. Beside her, Representative Jasmine Crockett adjusted her microphone, poised, composed, but with that unmistakable spark in her eyes. She knew what was coming. The audience didn't. The segment was supposed to be routine, another panel debate on education and qualifications. But then, in a tone dripping with condescension, a pundit from across the table leaned in and fired the question that would soon flood every corner of the internet. "Remind us, Congresswoman," he said, smirking, "where exactly did you get your law degree?" The silence that followed wasn't quiet. It was electric. The host blinked. Jessica shifted forward, sensing the blow, but not the brilliance that was about to follow. Cameras zoomed in. Social media users at home froze mid-scroll, instinctively knowing they'd just witnessed the start of something big. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Her lips curved into a slow, knowing smile. Not arrogance, but certainty. "The same place," she said softly, "where they teach you that integrity isn't optional." A low murmur rippled across the studio. The smirk on the pundit's face faltered, replaced by the faint realization that he had just walked into a trap of his own making. The viewers at home, the ones who had been dismissed, talked over, underestimated, felt it too. A flicker of pride, a pulse of vindication. Jessica looked at Crockett, her expression unreadable, but her eyes gleaming with recognition. Something big had just shifted. A viral storm was forming, one that would sweep across timelines and talking heads by morning. And as the commercial music faded in, one thought echoed everywhere. That wasn't just a clapback. That was history, in motion. But what happened after the break left the entire panel and the country in stunned disbelief. By the time the segment resumed, the room's energy had shifted. The smug confidence that had colored the earlier exchange had drained away, replaced by something heavier, the awareness that a line had been crossed. But to understand why Jasmine Crockett's poised response struck such a deep nerve, you have to understand what she was really up against. For months, the same undercurrent had been building across America's political talk shows, a coded skepticism wrapped in smiles and just asking questions. It wasn't just about policy or experience anymore. It was about belonging. Who gets to be seen as legitimate and who's expected to prove it twice over? Who gets to sit at the table and who's told to be grateful for the seat? Crockett, a black woman, a lawyer, a public servant from Texas, had been through this dance before. The insinuation that her credentials were somehow up for debate, that her presence and power needed to be justified. But this time, the country was watching live. Millions who had faced the same quiet dismissals at work, in classrooms, in airports, they saw themselves in her steady gaze. Jessica Tarlov felt it too. She wasn't the target, but she recognized the moment's weight. It wasn't just a question about a law degree. It was a challenge to the very idea of who is qualified to lead, who gets to speak with authority, who is allowed to stand without apology. And Crockett's calm, razor-sharp reply wasn't just a personal defense. It was a reclamation, a reminder that dignity doesn't require permission, that integrity once shown cannot be revoked by doubt. As the host shuffled his notes, pretending the tension hadn't just cracked the air in half, the pundit tried to recover, muttering something about just clarifying. But the damage was done. The internet was already erupting. Hashtags were forming, clips were being rewound, clipped, and shared. The moment was no longer confined to the studio. It was alive, pulsing through millions of phones, thousands of timelines. And behind that viral wave was something deeper, a national conversation rekindled about respect, about representation, about who America chooses to celebrate and who it tries to humble. As Jessica glanced at Crockett, a look of both solidarity and awe, the producer's voice crackled through her earpiece. "We're live again in 5, he said. The cameras blinked back on, red lights glowing. The pundit shifted uneasily, realizing this wasn't going to be the easy segment he had counted on. Because what came next, the exchange that would rewrite the night and ignite a million comments, defenses, and think pieces, wasn't just television. It was a reckoning. And as the first question after the break landed, the world held its breath. What happened next changed everything. The man behind that smug smirk, the one who had thrown the question like a dart meant to draw blood, was no stranger to controversy. His name, Grant Sheffield, a seasoned political commentator who had built a career on provocation disguised as insight. For years, he'd sat comfortably in front of cameras, polishing the art of undermining without ever saying anything directly cruel. His charm was his shield, his tone confident, teasing, detached, made his barbs sound like banter. But to those who had been targets of that polished ridicule, it was a familiar wound wrapped in civility. Grant had always known which buttons to push. He wasn't the loudest or the most extreme voice in political commentary. That wasn't his brand. His power came from subtlety, from making others seem emotional while he appeared rational. He smiled as he cut, framed his jabs as curiosity, and cloaked his prejudice in academic vocabulary. The audience that adored him believed he was the voice of reason, someone just telling it like it is. But what he was really doing was enforcing a hierarchy of legitimacy, one where certain voices never had to explain themselves and others always did. He'd made his reputation off these moments. Years ago, he'd mocked a young Latina mayor over her accent, joking that policy should be in plain English. The clip went viral then, too, but back then the outrage faded. He kept his job. He even gained followers. His producers knew that friction sold ad time, and as long as Grant was deposed while his opponents got angry, he won the optics war. But something had changed. America had changed. The veneer of Polito's respect was starting to crack. Audiences were tired of smugness parading his intellect. And that night, sitting across from Jasmine Crockett and Jessica Tarlov, Grant Sheffield didn't realize he had walked straight into the end of his own playbook. His question about Crockett's law degree wasn't spontaneous. It was scripted, a calculated provocation meant to shake her composure. The plan was simple. Corner her, make her defensive, then spin it as another emotional reaction from the left. The trick had worked before. He'd baited professors, activists, even senators into losing their cool. It was his signature move: lure, strike, retreat behind reason. But Jasmine wasn't playing by his rules. Her restraint disarmed him. Her smile cut deeper than outrage ever could. And in that still moment after her answer, Grant's armor, built on years of control, began to crack. You could almost see it in his eyes. Confusion giving way to irritation, irritation shading into panic. Behind the scenes, producers watched the live metrics spike. Comments flooded the network's page. "Did you hear how she handled him? That's grace under fire. Grant's finally getting exposed." The tide was shifting mid-broadcast, but Grant didn't see it yet. He leaned back, adjusting his tie, rehearsing his recovery lines. He'd done this 100 times. Steer the narrative, regain control. But what he didn't realize was that this wasn't just a bad moment on live TV. This was his moment, the one that would define him, replayed endlessly, not as a clever debater, but as a symbol of the old guard being outsmarted by the very people it underestimated. Because as polished as Grant's image was, his record told another story, of selective scrutiny, of questioning the credentials of women and minorities, while treating mediocrity from his own side as merit. That double standard had been invisible for years, hidden behind confidence and tone. But Crockett's calm dismantling of his premise had pulled the curtain back for everyone to see. For the first time, Grant Sheffield was no longer the one controlling the narrative. He was the narrative, and not in the way he wanted. And as the next segment approached, his smirk returned, a little tighter this time, forced. He didn't know it yet, but the moment he'd designed to prove someone else's inferiority would soon become the proof of his own undoing. Because the next exchange, the one the internet would replay frame by frame, would mark the exact second his legacy began to unravel. Long before the studio lights and viral headlines, Jasmine Crockett's story began in a modest home tucked into the beating heart of Dallas. The walls were thin, the summers were hot, and the dreams inside that little house were bigger than the square footage could contain. Her mother was a teacher, the kind of woman who refused to let her students give up on themselves, and her father, a postal worker, rose before dawn every morning, never complaining, always steady. They didn't have much, but they had values. Justice wasn't a word they used in grand speeches. It was in the way her mother defended every child's right to learn, in the way her father greeted every neighbor with dignity. From an early age, Jasmine understood that fairness wasn't promised, it was fought for. In her neighborhood, she saw how easily people were dismissed because of their accent, their paycheck, their zip code. But she also saw strength in community, the kind of strength that doesn't ask for permission to exist. That understanding didn't just shape her, it ignited her. When she walked into her first law school classroom, she felt the weight of generations pressing on her shoulders, the quiet, determined kind of pressure that says, "You belong here because we built the road for you to walk on." She carried that with her through long nights of studying, through professors who underestimated her, through whispers that suggested she was lucky to be there. Every dismissive look became fuel. Every challenge became proof. Years later, when she opened her first legal aid office, Jasmine wasn't chasing prestige. She was chasing fairness. Her clients were single mothers facing eviction, workers cheated out of pay, teenagers accused of crimes they didn't commit. She listened to them not as cases, but as people who'd been told no too many times. And in those small, crowded rooms, something became clear. The fight for justice wasn't about winning arguments. It was about restoring dignity. Her reputation grew quietly, built not on sound bites but on service. Judges noticed her preparation. Opposing attorneys respected her calm. She never needed to raise her voice because her conviction spoke louder than any outburst could. But that same poise, that measured control, would later become the very thing critics tried to use against her. They mistook grace for weakness and empathy for inexperience. They couldn't see that restraint was her sharpest weapon. When she ran for public office, she did it not out of ambition, but necessity. Her community had stories that were being ignored, and she was tired of waiting for permission to tell them. Her campaign wasn't funded by big donors or polished consultants. It was fueled by small contributions, neighbors knocking on doors, kids helping design flyers. People who had never believed politics could include them suddenly saw someone who looked like them, spoke like them, and stood for them. And when she won, it wasn't just a personal victory. It was a statement that the tables could turn, that integrity could triumph over cynicism. But with victory came scrutiny. Every speech she gave, every interview, every pause was dissected. Critics labeled her too emotional, too young, too direct. Yet through it all, she stayed anchored. Her compass wasn't fame, it was fairness. Her goal wasn't clout, it was clarity. That's what made the confrontation with Grant Sheffield so defining. It wasn't the first time she'd been questioned, but it was the first time the whole nation was watching. And she knew exactly what the question really meant. It wasn't about her education. It was about her right to be there, her right to belong. For many, that moment was a TV clip. But Jasmine, it was an echo of every time she'd been asked to justify her place. Yet what made her remarkable wasn't that she fought back. It was how she did it. She didn't lash out or trade insults. She chose composure. She chose the kind of grace that exposes arrogance for what it is, insecurity hiding behind confidence. When she said, "The same place they teach you integrity," she wasn't just answering a question. She was reclaiming a narrative. She was speaking for everyone who's ever had their worth questioned by someone who assumed authority was a birthright. That's why the internet didn't just react, it erupted. People felt seen. They heard in her tone the quiet courage they'd had to carry all their lives. Immigrants, women, working-class Americans, they saw their reflection not as victims, but as victors. Her calm was defiance. Her confidence was community. And as that clip spread across platforms, millions of views turning into millions of voices, Jasmine Crockett became more than a congresswoman defending her credentials. She became a symbol of earned pride, of what it means to rise without apology. But what no one yet knew was that the moment wasn't over. Grant Sheffield wasn't done. The cameras was still rolling, the microphone still hot, and pride, the kind that hides behind sarcasm, was about to drive him to a decision that would change everything. Because sometimes the true test of integrity isn't how you rise, it's how the world reacts when you do. When the show returned from its second break, the air was thick with the kind of silence that comes before an explosion. Cameras rolled. The panelists adjusted their notes. Grant Sheffield leaned forward, voice sugar-slick, eyes narrow. He had spent the break convincing himself he could take back control. But beneath his polished smirk, the cracks were spreading. "So," he began, tone dripping with mock civility, "since we're discussing qualifications, Congresswoman, maybe you can help us understand how passion replaces experience. Some might say you've made a career out of outrage." The words hung there like smoke. The audience in the studio murmured. Jessica Tarlov turned slightly toward Jasmine, not intervening, just watching. She sensed the setup, the trap disguised as inquiry. But Jasmine didn't blink. She leaned in, her voice calm, precise. "Passion isn't a substitute for experience, Grant. It's the reason experience matters. It's what turns policy into purpose." Grant chuckled, that condescending televised laugh that says, "I'm above this." "Purpose," he repeated. "That's a nice slogan. But let's be honest, Congresswoman. Some of us worked our way up the hard way. Others—" He paused, smirking toward the camera. "Just found the right hashtag." That was it. The line, too far, too revealing. The audience exhaled sharply, some even gasping. The mask had slipped. The coat of disdain that had always hid behind charm was suddenly naked. Jessica's eyes flashed. "Grant," she said evenly, "are you suggesting that representation or advocacy is performative?" He hesitated. "I'm saying that activism isn't accomplishment." Jasmine tilted her head, studying him like a lawyer reading a witness who just incriminated himself. "Funny," she said softly, "because where I come from, activism is accomplishment. It means you care enough to stand up when it's easier to stay quiet." The crowd murmured louder this time. Even the host couldn't hide the tension. Grant's smile wavered, his eyes darting toward the producers. He tried to recover, but his voice came out sharper than before, brittle with frustration. "Well, not everyone can just tweet their way into Congress," he snapped. And there it was, the unraveling. Jessica looked at him, then at the camera, and she said, "Or maybe," she said, low but lethal, "some of us don't need to tear others down to feel relevant." Grant froze, his jaw flexed. The control he'd built his reputation on, the art of making others emotional while he stayed calm, was gone. For the first time, he was the one rattled. Jasmine smiled, not triumphantly, but with that same measured grace that had silenced him before. "You know, Grant, it's fascinating you keep talking about the hard way. Maybe the hard way isn't how you got here. Maybe it's what everyone else has to survive just to sit across from you." The audience broke into spontaneous applause. Cameras caught Grant's expression, a flicker of embarrassment disguised his composure, and as the moderator tried to steer the conversation back, everyone could feel it. The shift was irreversible, because what happened next wouldn't just end the debate, it would end Grant's illusion of control forever. The host tried to regain footing, his voice cracking slightly as he introduced the next question, but no one was listening. Grant Sheffield had crossed a line, and everyone in that studio knew it. What was supposed to be another routine panel debate had turned into something far more dangerous, a reckoning, broadcast live. Jessica Tarlov sat back, her expression unreadable, but her eyes darted between the two combatants. She'd been on panels like this before, seen the same dynamic play out again and again, the smug interruption, the innocent condescension, the baiting disguised as logic. But what she saw now wasn't a debate. It was a storm gathering behind Jasmine Crockett's measured composure. Grant cleared his throat, trying to wrest back the narrative. "Look," he said, gesturing toward the camera, "I respect passion, but when we're talking about leadership, we're talking about results, not feelings, not identity, not—" He stopped, realizing too late that the words "not identity" had slipped out of his mouth. A low collective murmur spread through the studio. Jessica's eyebrows lifted, the host froze, and Jasmine Crockett, still perfectly still, perfectly calm, blinked once, slowly, like someone taking aim. Her voice, when it came, was steady as stone. "Identity," she said, almost whispering, "isn't something you can separate from leadership. It's how we understand the world we're leading. You want to talk about results, Grant? Let's talk about the ones that matter." The air tightened. "You see, results are not just the bills passed or the speeches given. Results are the families who sleep easier because someone fought for their housing. Results are the kids who see someone who looks like them holding office and finally believe they can do it too. Results are the communities that were invisible until someone refused to apologize for who they are." She leaned slightly forward, hands clasped loosely on the desk, the posture of quiet authority. "So when you say not identity, what you're really saying is not accountability, because identity is just another word for truth, and some truths make people uncomfortable." Grant opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He wasn't used to being dissected this cleanly, this surgically. Jasmine continued, her voice never rising, each word deliberate. "You think representation is a hashtag. I think it's survival. You think activism is noise. I think it's history catching up. You think we're emotional, we're human, and that's something politics could use a little more of." The audience erupted into spontaneous applause, but Jasmine didn't pause for validation. She kept going, eyes fixed on Grant, not to humiliate, but to illuminate. "Let me tell you something, Grant. You can have every degree, every title, every platform in the world, but if you use them to belittle people who fought twice as hard to stand where you stand, that's not leadership, that's insecurity. Because real confidence doesn't need to question someone else's worth to prove its own." A beat of silence. The host's pen stopped moving. The cameraman adjusted the zoom instinctively, drawn into the intensity of the moment. Grant tried to laugh it off, but his voice cracked, a tiny sound, barely audible, that told everyone he was losing control. Jasmine leaned back slightly, her tone softening, as though she were teaching rather than debating. "You ask me where I got my law degree. I'll tell you where. I got it from the same system that tried to count me out. I earned it in courtrooms where the stakes weren't ratings or retweets, but whether a kid got a second chance at life. I learned the law not to climb ladders, but to build bridges. And maybe that's the difference between us. You study arguments, I study people." Gasps, murmurs, a few audible wows. Jessica Tarlov's lips parted in astonishment. She'd seen hundreds of takedowns on live TV, snarky one-liners, perfectly rehearsed retorts, but this was different. This wasn't just a gotcha, it was moral clarity delivered with surgical grace. Grant swallowed hard, forcing a smirk. "Well, that's one way to see it, but politics isn't a therapy session, Congresswoman. It's about—" She interrupted, gently but firmly. "It's about people, Grant. Always has been, always will be. And if you've forgotten that, maybe that's why your version of politics doesn't inspire anyone anymore." That line hit like a thunderclap. The camera cut to Grant's face, his practiced composure gone, replaced with something rare for him: silence. He blinked twice, then looked down, as though suddenly realizing how many millions were watching. Meanwhile, Twitter, no, the entire internet was already exploding. #integrity isn't optional became trending within minutes. Clips were spliced, reactions filmed, TikToks narrated in awe. The moment had transcended the show itself. It wasn't just about Jasmine Crockett. It was about every person who'd ever been questioned, dismissed, or told to earn their place. And still, she wasn't finished. "Leadership," Jasmine said softly, almost like a benediction, "isn't about being the loudest in the room. It's about being the calm in the chaos. It's about knowing who you are, even when the world tells you to be someone else. That's where integrity comes from. And if that makes some people uncomfortable, well, maybe it should." The studio was silent except for the faint hum of the lights. Even the host, momentarily lost for words, couldn't bring himself to cut to commercial. Then finally, Jessica Tarlov broke the silence. "Well," she said quietly, a faint smile tugging at her lips, "that was one of the clearest definitions of leadership I've ever heard." She turned slightly, her eyes soft but unwavering. "It's not theory, it's lived experience." And as the camera zoomed out, Grant Sheffield stared at the table, his reflection shimmering faintly in the polished surface. A man realizing, perhaps for the first time, that he'd just become a cautionary tale. Because the mic drop moment that would define the night wasn't loud or cruel or theatrical. It was quiet, logical, unshakable. And it would echo far beyond that studio, through newsrooms, classrooms, and dinner tables, long after the lights dimmed. But the real shock waves were only beginning. By the time the credits rolled, the clip was already halfway across the internet. Within minutes, Jasmine Crockett's calm, searing rebuttal had been sliced, subtitled, and uploaded to every major platform: Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube Shorts. One tweet, just a 10-second clip of her saying, "Real confidence doesn't need to question someone else's worth," hit 1 million views in under an hour. The caption beneath it read simply, "The moment Grant Sheffield's career ended." Cable networks scrambled. Producers who had dismissed the segment as routine were suddenly cutting it into breaking news montages. Hashtags exploded. Hashtag integrity isn't optional. Hashtag Crockett clapback. Hashtag Grace over Groach. Overnight, Jasmine's words became the country's new vocabulary for dignity under fire. On TikTok, creators stitched the clip with stories of their own. A teacher explaining how she'd been talked over in meetings. A young immigrant lawyer who said she watched it 3 times, tears in her eyes. One post, filmed in a college dorm, summed up the sentiment perfectly. She didn't yell, she didn't stoop, she just told the truth. And the truth shook the room. Meanwhile, Grant Sheffield's name began trending for all the wrong reasons. Journalists dug up old clips, the English-only comment, the patronizing tone with female guests, the pattern that suddenly looked impossible to ignore. Commentators who had once called him sharp and unflappable now used words like outdated, tone-deaf, and the face of condescension gone wrong. His employer released a vague statement about editorial review, but everyone knew what that meant. By morning, the confrontation wasn't just a story, it was a symbol. Every major news outlet ran think pieces. The Atlantic called it a masterclass in grace. The Guardian said Crockett didn't destroy him, she exposed the culture that made him possible. Even late-night comedians jumped in, reclaying the moment with applause lines and audience cheers. Jessica Tarlov's quiet nod during the exchange became its own meme, dubbed the knowing look. People captioned it with phrases like, "Every woman in every meeting ever." She didn't need to say a word. Her expression had said it all. But beyond the viral high, something deeper was happening. Civil rights organizations quoted Jasmine's lines in fundraising emails. Professors played the clip in communication and ethics classes, and young organizers began tagging her speeches as examples of strategic composure, the art of winning without rage. And perhaps the most powerful ripple came from those who never even watched the show live. A retired veteran wrote on Facebook, "I don't usually follow politics, but this woman reminded me what integrity looks like." A teenager tweeted, "My mom just told me she wants to go to law school because of her." Grant, for his part, vanished from the airwaves for several days. When he finally reappeared, his tone was subdued, his trademark smirk gone. He called the incident a misunderstanding, but the apology rang hollow. The internet had already decided this wasn't a misunderstanding, this was accountability in real time. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett's office was flooded, not with scandal or backlash, but with gratitude. Letters poured in. Volunteers offered to help with community projects. For a moment, politics didn't feel like a performance. It felt like progress. And through it all, Jasmine stayed silent. No press tour, no victory lap. Just a simple post. When you stand in your truth, the noise can't move you. That silence spoke louder than any headline. By weekend, the confrontation had shifted from trending topic to cultural touchstone. Universities hosted panels titled "Dignity as Resistance." Podcasts debated whether this was a turning point in how women of color were perceived in leadership. But for those who watched it live, who felt that electric pause before Jasmine spoke, it was already history. A viral moment had become a mirror, forcing a nation to see itself. And yet, for all the celebration, a question lingered quietly in the public's mind. What would Jasmine do next? Would she let the moment define her, or use it to define something bigger? Because while the internet moved on to the next outrage, she was already thinking about the next step, the one that would turn a viral flash into a lasting movement. In the days that followed, the noise slowly softened into something more reflective. The endless retweets, the late-night punchlines, the political hot takes, they all began to fade, leaving behind what truly mattered, the message beneath the moment. For Jasmine Crockett, it was never about humiliation. She hadn't set out to embarrass Grant Sheffield or score a vital victory. What she'd done was simpler, purer. She'd held up a mirror, and in that reflection, America saw both its wounds and its potential. When she finally spoke publicly, it wasn't at a press conference or on a talk show. It was at a small community event in Dallas, a youth mentorship gathering she'd committed to long before the debate. The auditorium wasn't filled with cameras this time, just rows of high school students, teachers, and families. She walked to the microphone without notes, paused for a moment, and said quietly, "A lot of people have asked me what it felt like to win that debate. But I don't think of it as winning. I think of it as witnessing. a chance for people to see what dignity looks like when it's tested. The room fell silent. She went on, her tone gentle but firm. We live in a time where people mistake volume for strength, where shouting feels like power. But real power, the kind that changes hearts, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's steady. Sometimes it's the calm that refuses to break. The students leaned in. Some nodded, others recorded quietly on their phones. I wasn't calm because I wasn't angry, she continued. I was calm because I was angry, but I've learned that anger without direction just burns. Anger with purpose builds. That line would later become a quote shared thousands of times, printed on posters, even referenced in commencement speeches. But in that room, it was more than a soundbite. It was a truth delivered from someone who had lived it. She smiled then, the kind of smile that carried both weariness and hope. You know, Grant Sheffield didn't ask me that question because he wanted to know about my law degree. He asked it because he didn't know how to see me. But here's the thing, you don't need everyone to see you. You just need to see yourself clearly enough that their blindness can't blur your vision. Applause broke out, not the wild viral kind, but the kind that comes from recognition, from gratitude. She closed with the reflection that felt almost like a prayer. Every time you stand up with grace instead of aggression, every time you choose empathy over ego, you're doing something revolutionary. You're rewriting what strength looks like, and you're proving the truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. Those words rippled far beyond that Dallas auditorium. By the following week, her speech had been clipped and shared by educators, activists, and even a few of her former critics. The narrative had evolved. It wasn't just about one confrontation anymore. It was about redefining how we confront it all. Even some of Grant's former supporters admitted the moment had made them think differently. One conservative columnist wrote, "Crockett's composure exposed the emptiness of arrogance. She reminded us that civility, when rooted in conviction, is not weakness. It's the highest form of strength." And that, in the end, became the legacy of the moment. Not outrage, not revenge. Reflection. A reminder that the real victory isn't in silencing others. It's in refusing to be silenced. As Jasmine left that event, the crowd surrounded her, not as fans chasing a headline, but as people touched by something genuine. She stopped to take photos, to listen, to thank. Somewhere across the country, Grant Sheffield sat alone in a quiet studio, watching a clip that had defined his unraveling. For the first time, he didn't see an opponent. He saw a teacher. And in that strange symmetry lay the moral that millions had already learned. That ego burns bridges, empathy builds them. That pride fades, but truth endures. And as the night sky over Dallas glowed faintly with city light, Jasmine Crockett's words lingered in the air like a promise. The calm will always outlast the storm. The clip that began as a spark of confrontation had become something else entirely, a light that refused to fade. What started as a clash of egos on national television had evolved into a story about something deeper, something enduring, the quiet triumph of dignity over division. In a world addicted to outrage, Jasmine Crockett's calm had become radical. Her poise was protest, her truth an act of defiance against the culture of noise. She hadn't needed to shout to be heard. She'd simply stood her ground, and in doing so reminded millions that composure is not compliance, it's courage in its purest form. The viral moment may pass, but its message won't, because every time someone replays that clip, they're not just watching a debate, they're witnessing a blueprint for how to rise above disrespect without losing yourself. Grant Sheffield's sneer, once a symbol of arrogance, has already faded into static. But Jasmine's words, calm, grounded, unshakable, continue to echo across screens, classrooms, and hearts. And maybe that's the lesson. History doesn't always belong to the loudest voice. Sometimes it belongs to the one that refuses to be broken. So as the music swells and the screen fades to black, her message lingers one last time, not as an argument, but as an invitation. If you believe in dignity over division, share this message. Let the calm speak louder than the chaos.